And so this idea of taking religious studies out of the church as a sphere also developed. But also approaching all things through a scientific manner, including the Bible. Right? Approaching it scientifically instead of approaching it through faith. And so through the 19th century, there are a couple of things that develop that are moving us into the field of biblical studies as a discipline, but aren't necessarily positive developments. One of those is what becomes known as higher criticism. Now, we talked about textual criticism, right? That's taking the manuscripts and looking and saying, okay, what is the best reading, right? Which of these, if there's differences, right, relatively few or major ones, right, which appears to be the best reading? Which appears to have been the one the author originally wrote? That's textual criticism. That becomes known as lower criticism. Higher criticism was more concerned about not just determining the best reading of a text, but the question of how did the text develop? So, well, wait a second, what's behind all of this? What's behind all of this is Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species. Now, prior to 1859, when Darwin publishes On the Origin of the Species, there were some scientists who had believed in evolution. Right? The species had developed over time. But there wasn't a good method that a lot of people agreed on to try and explain this idea of evolution. And so Darwin develops this idea known as natural selection, that certain species better fit certain environments. And so they are able to better get at resources and then better able to reproduce. And so their genes are propagated over several generations. And so that's how they evolve, because the genes that provide better ability to reproduce and get to resources. And so, okay, how does that have anything to do with biblical studies? Well, by the end of the 19th century, a lot of scientists accepted natural selection and evolution. But then people turned to other aspects of human culture, because it was assumed that if we evolved as a species, which I don't think we necessarily have, but I mean, you follow the reasoning. If we have evolved as a species, then our forms of culture have evolved as well. And for a lot of people, that would include religion. And so the assumption becomes that human beings, as we move into like the Homo sapien species, started with very simplistic forms of religion, believing in this kind of spiritual power that permeated the universe, and then they believed in spirits, and then they believed in multitude of gods, and then eventually these systems developed that were monotheistic. And so taking this idea of evolution of culture, the assumption then becomes that the Bible evolved over time. And so this higher criticism was this assumption that you could determine different stages of biblical texts. A good example of this, good might not be the best term, but an example that shows this is what's known as the documentary hypothesis. The documentary hypothesis was an assumption about the origins of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. The traditional belief of the Pentateuch was that it had been authored by Moses. Well, the assumption was that Moses wasn't the sole author, if an author at all, behind the documentary hypothesis. That instead, these documents developed over time. And it was then assumed, or broken down into, the idea that there were discrete sources to the Pentateuch that could be determined. Again, I don't think this idea holds water, right? But I'm just saying that this is how we're progressing. And so there were 4 sources that were assumed to be behind this text. And they were identified by different letters. The kind of original source was identified as, well, the two that were considered to be original were J and E. It was believed that then another source, D, was added, and then a fourth source, P, was then added. Now, since the 19th century, this has been called into question, right, for a variety of reasons. But this was the assumption that you could take the biblical text, break it down, and determine that there were different sources and that the text had evolved. And so the assumption in its classical form was that the J source and the E source were written somewhere in the 8th century BC, which would of course be several hundred years after Moses. Eventually the D source was probably added around the 600s, and then somewhere in the 500s BC the P source was added. The P stands for priest. And so the idea was that the priests added their own bits in all of this. The D source was the Deuteronomist. And so this was entirely Deuteronomy. It had been developed by one particular source, but scholars believe they could find traces of the Deuteronomist even in the other four books of the Pentateuch. J and E referred to two different names for God. E for Elohim, usually just translated God, and J for, well, you might think Jehovah, but it's not Jehovah. It's actually Yahweh. And Yahweh in German starts with a J, right? And so it's the Germans that are doing all of this, right? And so J refers to this idea of there was this source, and this source only referred to God as Yahweh. And so when you go through modern scriptures, you'll often find that Lord with the capital L and the small caps. Everybody know what I'm talking about? Right. If not, go back and look through, find some passage, you'll find it. It's capital L and then small caps of O-R-D. Right? Usually that translates the Hebrew word that most people think probably was pronounced Yahweh. And then when you see God, it tends to be Elohim. And so this was the assumption, that there was a J source, an E source, a D source, and a P source, and over time they were all kind of amalgamated, intertwined with each other, and became the modern Pentateuch. Well, why did people believe that this was the case? Well, one thing that they claimed was that the idea that God had different names, right? That sometimes he's called Yahweh and sometimes he's called Elohim, suggests that there were two sources. One that called God Yahweh, one that used Elohim.
I was just saying, in Hebrew, isn't Elohim that's not a name, it's just a plural word for God, right?
Well, when you have like Genesis 1:1, right? In the beginning, Elohim created, and so, it's just kind of, Yahweh seems to be God's personal name, and Elohim is more of, we might say, title or something like that. It might be a way to put it. But the idea was, sometimes he's called Elohim, sometimes he's called Yahweh, so there must be, well, no, right? I mean, there are different ways. If you are writing a history of, let's say, the monarchy in England, sometimes you might say the king, sometimes you might say George III. Right? And so you could see that you could be the only one writing the source, and you might use two different names for the people you're talking about. So, but the idea was that you had these two different names, and sometimes it didn't make sense to the scholars as to why you have Elohim in some places and Yahweh in other places. There were other cases that people said, well, there seems to be different stories in the Old Testament that seem to be put together. And you may have heard of something like this, that there are two different creation stories. There's Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2. And so the claim is that the Yahweh source wrote Genesis 2, Elohim source wrote Genesis 1, P had a handle in some of that too, and then they just get combined in the book of Genesis. And the assumption is that that Genesis 2 says something different than Genesis 1. So the key thing for this is, so God creates Adam. Decides it's not good for Adam to be alone, and so he creates all these animals and brings them to Adam, for Adam's name, finds out there's not a helper suitable for Adam, and so he creates Eve. But if you look in Genesis 1, the animals get created first, and then Adam and Eve are kind of talked about being created together. So, people said, oh, there's two different creation stories. Well, there are ways to get around that and not appeal to two different people who are writing this. Genesis 1 seems to be this magnificent discussion of God's creation and just the beauty of it and the all-encompassing nature of it. Well, Genesis 2 appears to be more of a specific focus on Adam and Eve and the creation of Adam and Eve and their relationship. So, simply because there's some difference doesn't mean that there's two different people working at it. It could be like this kind of, what you might say, the 10,000-foot view, and then the ground level view. But for scholars already thinking these texts have evolved, different stories mean different writers. And so it became very popular to say that the Pentateuch wasn't written by Moses. And so for years, this was a common theme among people that were accepting evolution or accepting a lot of those other types of things. A lot of conservatives, of course, responded and tried to defend Mosaic authorship. Now, certainly, I will admit, there are places in the Pentateuch that do not seem likely to have come from Moses, that were maybe added by Joshua. So, for example, things about Moses' death. Doesn't seem likely that Moses is writing down, what they're going to do with my body, right, and how long they're going to mourn for me before it happens. But that's at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. So probably Joshua or somebody after Moses wrote that down. Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, where Moses is described as the meekest man in all the earth. Can't truly be meek and say you're meek, right? Like, I'm so humble. No, you're not, if you say that. So maybe there are places where somebody else has put in some things, like I said, things that happened after Moses' death. But not enough where you could just say, none of it's written by Moses. And so the few minor places where Joshua or someone else might have edited don't totally throw out Mosaic authorship like some of these people wanted to do. Not only is there question of the Old Testament, there becomes question about the New Testament as well. And one thing that comes up is the question of the historical Jesus. Since we only have about 5 minutes left, we'll go ahead and quit early today because the historical Jesus issue is a little bit more complicated than what we can handle in 5 minutes. But before we quit, I want to stop and say, are there any questions, anything we need to clarify? All right, if not, we'll pick up on Wednesday with the historical Jesus and how that fits into all of this.